Hello and welcome to slides 4.3, Rabbis for Human Rights. This is the third group of religious Orthodox Jews for human rights that we are analyzing this week. Rabbis for Human Rights is an NGO, or a non-governmental organization that was established in 1988. And this means at the beginning of the first Intifada, which started, as you know, in December 1987. The background and the social and cultural background, as well as the provenance of the rabbis that make part that are part of this group, is very different from the organizations that we've seen before. Most of them are Reformed or conservative rabbis. Most of them come from the U.S. They were born in the 1950s and then immigrated to Israel in the 1970s. So it's really a very different picture from the two previous organizations. Many of them had also familiarized with movements that were anti-war movements already in the U.S., or movements that were fighting for the rights of minorities and for the respect of human rights in other parts of the world. Their idea, the original idea of this group, was to raise a Jewish voice against a disproportionate reaction, what was considered by many of them a disproportionate reaction of the state of Israel against Palestinians during the first Intifada. And the initiator, one of the founders, actually the founder of the group, was Rabbi David Foreman. Rabbi David Foreman is a Reformed rabbi, born in 1944 in the States, and then who immigrated to Israel in 1972. His experience was really with, he was the president and the founder in 1970 of the Cincinnati Council for Soviet Jewry, and then in 1973 of the Jerusalem Council for Soviet Jewry. And it's interesting to note that between 84 and 86, he was also the president of an association called Interns for Peace. And this was an organization established in 76 from an Israeli Palestinian, Farhat Agbaria, and by an Israeli rabbi, Bruce Cohen, also originally from the States. His CV, if you want, in human rights and in the promotion of dialogue is quite prominent. But as in other cases that we've seen, the beginning of a reflection on Zionism and human rights and the rights of Palestinians started for Rabbi Foreman also during the Lebanon War. And I would like to summarize here for you a very long testimony that he gave of his awakening somehow, or for like the call for that something should be done. And he recalls how at the beginning of July 1982, during the Lebanon War, in fact, he was on the highway Beirut-Damascus together with his fighting unit. And as they were attacked by tanks and missiles, he remembered saying to a comrade, another soldier, "Don't you think that we should reconsider our devotion to Zionism?" And this is, in his memory, stayed there. Nothing else was done. But then a new awakening somehow occurred a few years later, immediately after the first Intifada, when his elder daughter who was wearing a T-shirt with the words "Freedom of Press," was actually accused at a bus station of being a traitor in a way, and this daughter telling her father the insult, feeling insulted by being accused as a lover of Arabs because of her T-shirt, prompted somehow her father's reaction. And I'm now quoting from the testimony of Rabbi Foreman. He said, completely flabbergasted, I asked myself how it could be possible that I had been an activist for my whole life, that I could pass under silence what was going on during the Intifada, when it was obvious that the reaction to the Intifada on behalf of the government was extreme. And what immediately came to my mind was were these words that come from the Talmud. If you see someone in your family that commit a crime, and if you don't do anything to stop that person, you are considered responsible of the crime of the whole family. And here Rabbi Foreman sees the beginning, the establishment of Rabbis for Human Rights. After this event, he wrote to some colleagues, and the idea was to establish a rabbinical voice for a moral and human sense as an opposition to the voices that came from the rabbinical establishment that seemed to justify, in the name of Jewish tradition, the violation of human rights against Palestinians. And so, in this way, Rabbi for Human Rights was born, and as Rabbi Foreman continues, its main aim was and continues to be that of becoming a useless association, but for now it is an absolutely necessary association. So there are a number of activities that Rabbis for Human Rights engage with, and they're all connected to the defense of human rights of Palestinians and on the dissemination of information on these violations and on the activities of Rabbis for Human Rights. So there is one aspect of denunciation and protest, but also an educational aspect of the activities of Rabbis for Human Rights among youth, soldiers, and the border police. You can easily find annual activity reports on the website of Rabbis for Human Rights, which is listed with the links to to many associations in your linkography, let's say, and they're very interesting reports. There's also Rabbi for Human Rights operates more within Israeli society than among Palestinians, if you wish. But from the 1990s, this started to change in various ways, as we shall see. First of all, let me mention the bringing solidarity activity. And we have here a very important example. We've already encountered Rabbi Moshe Levinger, one of the founders of Gush Emunim, in fact, the man who sparked off settlement in Hebron in 1968 already. Rabbi Moshe Levinger was released from prison in 1990, where he had been convicted for 2 years for the homicide of a Palestinian retailer called Hayed Salah. And when he was released, a delegation of Rabbis for Human Rights visited the family of the victim to oppose the demonstration of the supporters of Levinger, who was considered, obviously, and was highly offensive for the family and for the memory of the murdered Hayed Salah. So there is this idea of bringing solidarity and also of intervening in helping Palestinians in activities that are becoming increasingly more difficult for the bureaucracy, for the way the occupation works, and for the bureaucracy of the occupation. We've seen all this happening with the checkpoints, the bureaucracy connected with the checkpoints, and if we look at two other activities, for example, olive harvesting in the Palestinian villages or the opposition of house demolitions, we find again other sectors where the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy of the occupation and the violation of human rights that it brings are at their worst, I would say. So here is the campaign for helping Palestinians harvesting olives every beginning of the winter, if you want. And this is one of the most engaging activities, recruiting volunteers to harvest olives. In fact, the contacts of the Rabbis for Human Rights with Palestinian villages it varies, it changes year after year. There could be 20, 30 villages that are in contact with Rabbis for Human Rights. Sometimes it has been even 50. Sometimes Rabbi for Human Rights doesn't manage to be physically present with volunteers at the harvest of olives, but then they call and they make contact with representatives of the army and of the police so that they help in a way that they guarantee Palestinians the harvesting of the olives, for example. And it has now been more than 15 years that Rabbis for Human Rights deals with the harvesting of olives. The most problems that have been recorded are obviously those with settlers and sometimes with the army. Now, the question is, how comes that an NGO so opposed to the occupation comes to ultimately gets in touch and works with the army to help Palestinians harvest olives? How did this happen? In 2006, the Supreme Court of Israel pronounced a sentence on the question of the harvesting of olives in the West Bank. And Rabbis for Human Rights was present in court with the representatives of 10 villages, Palestinian villages, and they presented the cases of the problems connected to the violence of the settlers on the Palestinians' agricultures, and the problems connected to accessing the land. And the High Court established that the army should have kept order and should defend Palestinians if these were attacked by settlers. And these somehow changed the rules of the game. And from that point onwards, since 2006, Rabbis for Human Rights also keeps contact with the army. As in the case of Mahsom Watch, exactly with the same dynamic, if you like. This presents, it may seem to be can appear as a sort of collaboration with the occupation, as a normalization activity. But in a way, being in touch with the army and with the legal office of the army allows Rabbis for Human Rights to have the maps of the areas that have been closed, so that the volunteers can obtain permits to get to these areas and help Palestinians to get in to harvest olives under the supervision of the army and of the soldiers. So there are different implications to this kind of activities, but the season for the harvesting of olive is really the one of greatest activity for the association. And they often manage to organize buses with between 10 to 20 people. Volunteers speak Hebrew, obviously, and they are therefore able to discuss and to mediate with the army. And again, remember that one of the functions of civil society is to negotiate with the state, with the representatives of the state. In a way, this does not help change or transform the political reality, but at least helps. That is the hope, but at least it helps in the short term, but at least every year. Remember that another characteristic, another feature of civil society was to network with others to, again, transform political reality. We have here a case of connection between Rabbis for Human Rights and the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, ICAD, an association established by Jeff Halper that is based in Jerusalem. And here you have a poster, Stand with Susia, Note Demolition, and I've downloaded a video that you can also see on YouTube that explains, it's actually a cartoon that explains the situation of the inhabitants of Susia twice, and unfortunately maybe 3 times dispossessed from their lands. And it's very interesting that Rabbis for Human Rights took up this campaign and supported it together with many other NGOs and organizations in Israel and on the international field. There are other sectors of intervention of Rabbis for Human Rights. The situation of the Bedouins of Jahalin, those who live just outside Jerusalem in the occupied territories, and the latest campaign, which has also been very strongly supported by B'Tselem and others, the dispossession of the Bedouins of the Negev, according to the Prower Commission. Unfortunately, I do not have the time, nor this is the right unit, in a way, to deal with this topic, but I refer you to, first of all, the website of B'Tselem, which is listed certainly in one of the our weeks, I can't remember which one now, and there you can find a lot of information. Just to present you the last slide, these are two posters against house demolition, which, as you know, is a punitive measure adopted by the IDF for security, for, in inverted commas, for security reasons. And I encourage you to look at the website of the association and see the balanced approach that they have between defending the violation of human rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories, but also of encouraging Israeli society in Israel proper to ground their notion of citizenship on an inclusive rather than an exclusive approach. Now, before we move on to our last group, which is called Eretz Shalom, I just would like to mention the differences between these groups that we've seen thus far and the last one that we will see in our last slides. First of all, Ozve Shalom and Netivot Shalom are more focused, if you like, on Israeli society, on the educational and awareness dimension, while Rabbis for Human Rights and the next one that we will see, Eretz Shalom, cooperate with Palestinian society, however, with different objectives. Rabbis for Human Rights focus on the defense of human rights of Palestinians inside Israel and in the Palestinian territories. Eretz Shalom focuses mainly on trying to build relationships, exchanges, and cooperations with Palestinians in the West Bank. And they do so because they are settlers, and therefore they live in the West Bank. And as a result, they start from the ground, from there, with a very particular interpretation of their role in the order of things. So follow me to the next set of slides and we'll have a look at Eretz Shalom. Thank you. Ciao.